and we're going live now.
Good morning, everybody. Fantastic to have you with us today on a slightly miserable, damp Tuesday morning in February. This is the second time that we've done one of these live events, which we will be recording and you'll have access to afterwards. The way in which you can interact with us, and we're really encouraging you to do so this morning, is through the question and answer function in the live event. I'll do some introductions in a moment, but just around housekeeping, at the top of your screen where you are in this event, you should have a little speech bubble, which will be a link to the questions and answers. If you'd like to type your questions in there, they come through to us and we can either comment to you directly, or we'll publish the whole question and everybody can see the answers. It's great if you can keep the themes general. If you've got any specific questions, we probably wouldn't publish those live. What we'll probably do then is to contact you individually and pick that conversation up separately. So we'll move on into the event. I'm Kath Saunders. I'm one of the heads of locality and strategy within Children's Services at Dorset Council, and I'm also the strategic lead for our SEND service. And I've got a number of colleagues with us today who I'll introduce to you. And we're here to hear from you. We're here to try and answer some of the questions that you've got. We have representatives from Dorset Parent Carer Council, and we have representatives from our CCG and other colleagues from Dorset Council. So I'll pass people round so that they can introduce themselves, and I'll come across to Miriam Lee first, please.
Morning, everybody. Yeah, I'm Miriam Lee, and I'm the Principal Educational Psychologist, and I have a responsibility as well as managing the service of the educational psychology team, and there are senior educational psychologists in each locality, and I work with them around the strategic direction of the educational psychologists and the quality of the work that we provide and support that we provide to schools. I also hold a responsibility around managing some of the decision making and quality assurance around our processes around SEND and safeguarding, making sure our safeguarding process, we're safeguarding what we do for our children and young people with special educational needs.
And we come over to Hal.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Hal Williams. I'm the service manager for children who are disabled. That's a social care team in Dorset. So we do three main things, I suppose. So we are here to support disabled children and their families at home through assessments for short break support. So that can be direct payments, and that could be kind of nights away from the family home. So we do that. We have a sort of a child protection safeguarding function. So we look out for the wellbeing of disabled children in Dorset, and we also look after children in care. So children who can't live at home with their parents, we're responsible for. We also have an occupational therapy wing of children who are disabled as well. So they do assessments for adaptation in children's homes, as in children live at home with their parents.
Thank you, Hal. And we'll come over to Sam Best and Elaine Hurl from the CCG.
Thank you, Kath, and good morning, everybody. My name is Sam Best and I am Principal Lead for Children and Young People for Dorset Clinical Commissioning Group. I'm a nurse and a health visitor by background, so I've got a little bit of clinical experience as well alongside my commissioning role. In terms of our portfolio in the CCG, we're currently working on children and young people's transformation, and that is really linked into the NHS long-term plan with a focus on improving the quality of care for children and young people with long-term conditions such as diabetes, obesity, asthma and epilepsy. We're also looking at palliative care and end-of-life services and developing a bowel and bladder health pathways. So, and we're also working very closely with our colleagues in the CCG on the all-age autism pathway. Some of you may be aware of that. There have been some recent challenges and demands on the team which have slowed our progress down, but we've had excellent engagement from our stakeholders. And in terms of next steps for this, we're revisiting our needs analysis to ensure we've got a very strong baseline. We're also starting to think about how we can implement some of our access recommendations in developing a dedicated website. We're also going to be launching the Dorset Autism Training Offer and ensure really that we're providing regular and accessible communication with you all. The other piece of pathway work that I want to mention is the speech, communication and language needs pathway. And certainly we're developing that pathway. We have agreed investment, which is really good news. And we're focusing on developing the pathway from universal offer all the way through to specialist services. So I'm going to hand over to Elaine now.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Elaine Hurl. I work at the Dorset CCG with Sam. I lead on children and adolescent mental health services, so CAMS, and got a few other bits of interest as a mental health social worker, and worked across mental health for a lot of years. So I come with a little bit of experience around that. So at the CCG and nationally, CAMS have been changing and actually catching up with adult services, to be honest, since 2016. We've made some significant changes, but we're currently at a place where more sort of structural change needs to happen to children's mental health services. So it fits with the long-term plan, like Sam said, around making sure that every young person who's got a mental health need can come through to some form of support, either in NHS services or in other areas, but so that any young person at the time they present with a condition that can get support. So we've introduced schools teams, mental health schools teams. There aren't enough of them. I think we want to go at pace to make sure that every school has access to mental health support. We've got the gateway, which is the single point of entry into CAMS. It's up and running, but the demand is huge and increasing, and I think that's sort of reflected probably nationally as well. We've got crisis services, one care closer to home, which is for young people who might already be heading towards a hospital admission, and another service that's going to come online that will support young people and their families much earlier in their crisis, in order to prevent that really sort of developing. So those kind of key changes will enable us to re-look at the way the sort of main CAMS teams look and the way they work. And partly the reason for that is that with those three changes, the other services kind of need to slot into place. But also looking at the young people who come through to CAMS, at least 50% have a neurodiverse condition, and our current setup isn't working for that group of young people or their families, and also around trauma and attachment and all those things that CAMS currently sort of manages but doesn't do it that well. And so I think it's a good time to change things and to really focus on getting that done, and it's the right time, and hopefully ahead of before the end of the long-term plan. That's the aim, I think. And I'll shut up now.
Thank you very much, Elaine. And we'll hand over now to Vic Verma, who's our Director for Education.
Good morning, everyone. So thank you for joining us this morning. I'm Vic Verma, Corporate Director for Education and Learning. So within my role, I oversee school improvement and the interface with our academies and the Department for Education. Also lead our SEND service with colleagues who you've already been introduced to. And then we have other roles in terms of part of my portfolio is also the virtual school, which is supporting our children in care, leading our educational psychology and specialist teaching services, which also include our hearing and vision support services, and then also making sure we have sufficient school places across Dorset as well. And we'll come on to talk a bit about that, both in terms of mainstream schools, but also SEND as well. We launched our new SEND strategy in the autumn of last year, which a link will be dropping into the chat any moment. So I'll talk a little bit about just what we set out as our priorities for the next 3 years as part of that. But in particular, our vision is really that we want children and young people with SEND to be happy, healthy and safe, and to be able to achieve their potential to lead a fulfilling life. And in particular, we want them to have and expect the same opportunities in life as they do as other children and young people. And we've set out 6 areas that we think are key to enabling that that vision. So firstly, the first priority for us has always been around early identification and support. And in the context of the pandemic and the increased need of some of our children and young people, whilst we know every child has had a different experience of the pandemic, we know that there has been an increase around things like that anxiety, that returning to school, but also meshing that online working at home during the lockdowns and now returning to school more fully. And we're delighted to see our children and young people back in school, which is why there's a couple of areas we focused on in particular. So the Dorset Education Advice Line, and again, we'll drop a link in the chat, but you may have seen this in our newsletters recently. There's an advice line which is available to you as parents, but also to our school colleagues in terms of teachers, our SENCO colleagues, head teachers, and also governors. So all of our colleagues working within the education system to seek advice and support if they identify an emerging need. And so far, we've had some great calls from families which have enabled us to support early. And that's sometimes been children with EHCPs, but more often than not, it's been children who, so families of children where they're identifying a need early and starting to think about what additional support could we be putting in place as part of our graduated approach. We also have launched our new SENCO network, which is to support our schools and SENCOs to start working together more, to share ideas and best practice across all different phases of education. And that's really helping in terms of that early identification. But alongside that, our second priority is around inclusion in mainstream. Every child with SEND has a right to be taught alongside their peers in mainstream. And there's a couple of areas we've been looking at there as part of the strategy which launched this academic year, which is the development of our outreach service. So that's delivering CPD and training to teachers about different ways that we can work and differentiate to support children with additional needs, both in terms of any children that are supported through SEN support, but also within EHCP as well. And a good example is Dorset Steps, which is led by my colleague Miriam Lee, who's on the call today, which is a restorative strengths-based approach to managing challenging behaviours and dysregulation. And it's giving our teachers more tools in their toolkit to support children and maintaining more of our children amongst their mainstream peers. We're also looking at this year launching our first few inclusion hubs, which is essentially provision that will be placed within a mainstream school site. So in the past, this has been called CCN, complex communication needs bases. We'll be expanding that to an additional 100 places across Dorset over the next few years as part of our SEND capital investment, and that should create capacity within mainstream schools where children can learn alongside their peers, but also have some spaces and places where they can receive some more specialist support and therapeutic input to help them stay in mainstream. In terms of our SEND pathway, so my colleagues Sam Best and Elaine from the CCG talked a bit about the work we're doing in terms collaboratively in terms of pathways, and we've also just approved our new partnership agreement to work more closely with our CCG and Dorset Parent Carer Council, which sets out a number of areas to really make sure we are co-producing and collaborating across our local area. And then the bigger change that you'll have seen, and the bigger investment in particular, has been around expanding sufficiency, expanding more specialist provision in Dorset. More recently, so that's included the expansion of Broadcroft School in the east of the county, which we are expecting to open in September of this year, which will bring another 75 places and an enhanced post-16 offer for Broadcroft. We've also got Coombe House School, which you'll perhaps know as St Mary's, formerly at the Dorset Centre of Excellence, which are targeting to open the summer term of this year. And over time, we'll build up to 280 additional places, which will be an extremely large number of places for Dorset. Harbour School, which is a free school in Bovington, will grow this April to 160 places from its temporary accommodation into its full accommodation. And we also have the Osprey Quay Free School, which will bring 75 places, 14 to 19, into Portland, and we'll send all of this kind of information out in our next newsletter as a roundup to this meeting. But there's a number of projects happening now, and our intention is to create another 500 places over Dorset. With what I've just described now, we'll probably exceed our 500, and that's all part of the SEND £40 million investment into expanding specialist provision, but also alongside that is the inclusion hubs in mainstream. And then our fifth priority is around our transitions work and working more closely with our adult services on preparation for adulthood. And then finally, our priority around value for money and managing our financial resources, which is a challenge for a number of local authorities nationally in managing high needs blocks. And there's a high needs block management strategy that's available on our website, but making sure that we are using those resources to target need as best as we can. So that's just a quick run through. The link to the SEND strategy will be dropping into the chat as well. But this is really your time and your opportunity to ask questions. We've got a number of colleagues from across our partnership here with us this morning. So really hand over to you in terms of bringing questions in for us to answer for you. One thing we would ask, I suppose, is as this is a live event, we wouldn't want you to disclose specific details of yourself or your child. So if you can drop those into the chat, but we're very happy to talk about the context and some of the case studies examples that you'd have as families as well. So Kath, I'll hand back to you for any questions that have come through in the chat, and then we'll introduce colleagues as needed.
Thanks, Vic. Yeah, there aren't any questions that have popped up yet for us to answer. We've been dropping quite a few links to the various strategies and policies that we've talked about so far. But I thought it just might be helpful to talk a little bit about our frontline SEND teams. So as most of you will be aware, when Children's Services had a bit of a transformation piece back in 2020, we moved to a locality model. So this was very much about making sure that the professionals that you need to talk to and work with are based within their local areas and in their communities. And within our SEND teams, we have our provision leads, who were previously called planning coordinators or plan writers. So they will be the people who will lead the work around looking at the new needs assessment requests, undertaking the work alongside colleagues to undertake those assessments, and then writing the plans where a plan has been agreed. And they will also work through the annual review process. So at least once every year, every child with an education, health and care plan, we would expect to do a review. Sometimes that might happen more regularly if there is a change in circumstances. And we also have caseworkers who work alongside our provision leads. We also have SEND family workers, and increasingly we are looking at our SEND family workers coming alongside you and the schools and settings that that your children attend, to really understand where there are challenges and where there might be a situation where perhaps as a local authority we have said we don't think an education, health and care plan is needed, but we can see that your child, your young person probably has some additional needs that the school or the setting could be providing that support for. And so those family workers can come alongside, look at the information that we've got, and then work towards the support plan that the school or the setting would put in place. So that's a fairly new piece of work at the moment. Our SEND family workers are operating the Dorset Education Advice Line that Vic's mentioned. The links for that again are in the chat function for you, and you can book an appointment there. And actually what we're trying to do with that advice line is to provide that support where there are new and emerging needs, rather than for those of you who've already got children with an education, health and care plan, because your provision lead will be your key contact there. But for families where we've got emerging new needs, or perhaps something's not working quite right, and you just want that opportunity to talk to somebody, you can book that appointment. The family worker will talk that through with you, might signpost you to services that are already around, might talk you through options that you have. So really good to promote that amongst your friends and your families if you feel that's something that can help you. I know we've been criticised in the past for perhaps not responding in a timely way. We know that we don't always get our communication right, and it's certainly something that we are very committed to improving over the next year. And part of the work that Vic's described in terms of our strategy is about ensuring that we meet needs in a timely way. Just to give you some figures around that, in 2021 we produced new education, health and care plans. About 71% of them were achieved within that 20-week timeline. That means, of course, that about 30% of them weren't, and that's not great for those families. But that number is a strong number. Nationally, that figure is around 50 to 60%. And actually, in December, of the 25 plans that were issued, 24 of them were issued within 20 weeks. So that was really great performance. And that's something that our SEND team managers and our service managers in the localities are very much on top of, and very much wanting to keep a grip of, so that we make sure that you receive those services very much in a timely way. Our education psychologists are also part of our frontline SEND teams, and we also have specialist teachers and education specialists that sit within our localities. So it's very much about having that real collaborative approach and having those professionals together. So Vic, if I hand back to you.
Thanks, Kath. And we've got a few questions in the chat, so I'm just going to pull a couple of those out. So one in terms of, I think you were describing, so in terms of attendance at annual reviews, Kath, I don't know if you could talk a little bit about just how colleagues attend annual reviews and how we do that at the moment.
Yes, certainly. One of the things that we have done this autumn just past is to ensure that we've really focused on our most vulnerable young people. So young people who are perhaps electively home educated or who don't currently have a provision, those who have social care involvement, those obviously who are approaching their phase and age transfer. Those were very important annual reviews to undertake. It's actually the responsibility of the school or the setting, if a child is attending, to ensure that annual review happens. And of course our SEND teams come alongside schools to ensure that they happen and that the right information is shared. We've seen some really great examples of really inclusive annual reviews happening where professionals involved with the young person have been part of that annual review process, really being very strength-based, very person-centred in their approach. So putting the young person very much at the centre of that work, understanding what the needs for that young person are. Is that provision currently meeting those needs? Do we need to tweak the education, health and care plan? Do we need to make an amendment to it? Once the annual review has happened, there's a 4-week period to make any of those changes and to then publish a draft version of it for you as parents and carers to ensure that you're happy with those changes, and then move to a final plan. And we've had much more focus on our annual reviews. We're currently at about 70% of young people this academic year having now had their annual review, which is a much stronger position than we've had before. And the SEND caseworkers that we now have are alongside our provision leads and are very much leading the annual review process. So they're able to talk to schools to gently nudge where perhaps we've been asking to set a date for an annual review and we haven't had that date through, so the caseworkers can come alongside the school. So yeah, we're seeing a stronger performance around annual reviews now.
Thank you, Kath. And then a few questions around sufficiency, which I can take, and just how we're expanding provision. So there's a few on that topic that I'll try and bring together. So the additional places at Broadcroft, Harbour, so special schools admissions work in a slightly different way to our primary and secondary schools and our first, middle and upper schools, in that it's firstly about being able to meet need and then looking at the capacity of the setting. So so those places will be available in liaison with your SEND provision lead and thinking about their planning for their next phase of education, but also making sure that the special school that you are applying to is the right special school for your child based on the professional advice that we hold. So so the support that you may receive in Broadcroft School would be slightly different to other special schools in Dorset, and that's why working with our provision leads is really key to make sure that we are meeting the need in that way, but also where a child could have their needs met in mainstream settings with support, then actually we are working with you to make sure that is also in place. I've seen a couple of questions in terms of special school places for the youngest age group where it's their first school. The expansion of our special schools will release more capacity in younger settings, and Coombe House School, which will be our new special school in the north of the county, will be taking an intake from reception up to post 16 as well. Over time, it will grow slowly over time, but over the next 3 years, we're expecting it to get beyond 200 places. So so there is more provision for our reception age children and that Key Stage 1 cohort of children and young people. And when we talk about expansion, it's about expanding the whole school, releasing capacity for other year groups, not just having a post 16 or having another a particular year group that's expanding. It's giving us capacity across the whole setting. And we're also looking at our other special schools across Dorset, what kind of expansion we could offer in some of those settings. We're very fortunate to have outstanding and good special schools in Dorset. However, we're very aware that they are also full, and we need to make sure we release some of that capacity through that £40 million investment. Okay, Kath, I'll probably hand back to you on any other questions that are in the chat, if that's okay. Thanks, Kath.
Thanks, Vic. There's a question about locality teams, a really great positive comment. Thank you very much to whoever put that in there, that the locality teams are good. And I can see there that there is a challenge, however, around where you live in a particular locality and your child attends a provision in a different locality. So the SEND provision leads work with children who live within their locality, but they would always work with the schools that those children attend. So it might well be that although you live perhaps in Dorchester, your child might attend a school in North Dorset or in West Dorset. The SEND provision lead would be the key link there. It's interesting that you say that has caused a problem, and I'd be interested in you contacting me direct if you would like to raise any specific concerns there, because I'd like to understand perhaps what's happening. Our SEND provision leads should very much be linking with those schools that their children attend. So the kind of the border issues really shouldn't cause a problem. So yeah, I'm very sorry to hear that that's been your experience, and I'm very happy if you want to contact me direct.
Thank you, Kath. Just having a look through there are a few more questions coming through now, which is great. So I think there's a specific question about a child that's been out of school for a period of time, and I think if we take that one outside the meeting, I think Kath, you've shared your email address for that specific query. So there's a question here in terms of joint working across education, social care and health, and more whole family working. I'll bring together the beginning of the answer and then ask colleagues to step in, because our colleagues at work work in a locality model. So the locality approach that we take in Dorset is much more about our SEND service working hand in hand with our social care colleagues, inclusion colleagues and others, which means that there is a multi-agency focus. And when we're talking about things like annual reviews, we are doing that in a multi-agency way where we can pull in support from colleagues that are working with your child in that setting alongside the school, in partnership with the school. So that's been in place since September 2020, and we've been delivering that, and that was also held up by Ofsted in the recent inspection in October as a very strong model for how we work, and one that does keep our children at the centre, which is absolutely key for us to make sure that we co-produce our solutions, but make sure that we have professionals wrapping around children and that we support our settings in that way. So I'll probably bring Kath back in a moment, just in terms of describing that. So Kath is also one of our heads of locality, running our multi-agency support, and then possibly also Miriam as well, in terms of educational psychology and how the EP team input into annual reviews, and that's a really critical part of our service. So Kath, if I could bring you in just to describe a bit about how we work in that multi-agency way in localities.
Certainly, thanks, Vic. We're increasingly using the team around the school and the team around the family approach. So very much about ensuring that all the professionals who are involved with you and your family are able to attend those meetings, so that we get everybody's views. And again, the locality models really helped us there, because obviously the vast majority of the professionals from the local authority will be based together. We are still in the main working from home. Our work bases are available, and staff are increasingly coming back into those workplaces. And of course, the beauty of that is being able to have conversations with your colleagues when you're actually working together, and being able to have those really quick conversations that are needed, rather than having to wait formally to join a meeting, which of course has been a real challenge for us over the last 2 years, through the pandemic. But it'd be useful to bring Miriam in here to talk around the educational psychology approach too.
Thank you, Kath. Yes, absolutely. So the educational psychologists work very closely with our specialist teachers, and also they work closely. They have a lot of relationships with both health and social care. The localities have certainly strengthened that in terms of their relationships. They work with schools, so educational psychologists and specialist teachers have termly meetings with the special needs coordinators for all our schools, where they plan. They have conversations with the school about individual children, and also about provision, about building capacity, supporting the school to think differently around how can they implement some of the interventions and strategies to make them more equitable for all children that they have within the school. And they follow the graduated approach. And we've been working very closely with some parent carers so we have a graduated approach with the detail that specifies what we expect schools to be able to offer in relation to the universal offer, so that's for all children, and then a targeted offer, so that's for children who have some additional needs and may need a short-term intervention, and then they are able to progress and learn and access the curriculum. And then in the detail around what we would expect if that child needs greater intervention around specialists services. And we've broken that down into the 4 categories of need, and our colleagues, both educational psychologists and specialist teachers, and our inclusion teams use that very closely to identify with schools what provision needs to be put in place, how we can support them to understand that. Do they need further training? Do they need some coaching? And we support the schools to be able to do that. A diagnosis in itself doesn't mean that a child has a special educational needs. We follow the graduated approach. We've been working with parent carers on developing a parent-friendly version of the graduated approach, which is very soon to be published. So you will be able to see what we expect, just as we are providing that to schools. You as parents will also be able to say this is what is expected at those different levels, and we expect schools to be able to provide a certain level of support to all children at all levels.
Should I say something about co-working, really, I suppose, between SEN and children with children who are disabled service? So my service works with essentially the most profoundly disabled children in Dorset, and generally those children will be at our special schools, almost all supported with EHC plans. So I think we've been doing quite a bit of work in the last few months about really integrating my service and SEN. So certainly Kath and Miriam and I have been working very closely, always seem to be on the same panels, discussing the children who might be struggling at school or might be struggling at home, and really thinking about the bigger picture and thinking about them holistically and kind of what we need to do to wrap around and support generally. So I do think we have been doing a lot of work on sort of just kind of rubbing away at those barriers really between services and seeing families absolutely as a whole. When we have our children supported on child in need plans, we absolutely expect that the schools are involved in child in need meetings, and that that colleagues from SEN are involved in those. And likewise, I'm absolutely making sure that my social workers are attending annual reviews and kind of really feeding into the EHC planning process. So there's always more work to do, and I think in particular we're really focusing now on building bridges with the NHS, so with health services, and absolutely improving that transitions journey. So that journey from birth to settled adulthood. So we're doing a lot of sort of integrating with adult services. But I think, you know, and I joined Dorset just towards the end of last year, back in November. But I was really sort of pleasantly surprised about the amount of kind of joint thought and joint working and integration that's happening across services. That is absolutely our starting point, that we look at the family as a whole. So definitely work in progress, and we would really welcome, I think, kind of comments and queries around how we're doing on that. But yeah, it's an absolutely key focus for us, is seeing the family as a whole rather than isolated bits of service.
Thank you, Hal. Just coming through the questions now, so there's a couple of additional questions to bring in. So a question about a reception age child who's unable to access school due to anxiety. This is a great example of where our Dorset Education Advice Line can support, but also our inclusion services working with you. So I think to the person that's raised that particular question, if you make contact with us, we'll drop an email address and reply to your query. Our team would work with you, again, as we described, in a multi-agency way, to have a think about what professional advice might we need, what kind of provision might help your child get back into school, and then working in collaboration with schools in your local area to make sure that your child can attend. So I won't go into the specifics of that because there'll be specific detail, but if we take that outside of this discussion and reach out to you privately, that may be the best way for us to tackle that one. In terms of speech and language therapists, there have been there have been challenges through the pandemic for any families that are online where their children receive speech and language. You'll know that for a period of time during the early lockdowns, children weren't receiving those therapies in the same way at all. They were then receiving it probably behind a mask or a visor of some kind, which again became a challenge in terms of access and barriers for children to be able to access therapeutic input. So it's been a really challenging time for our children who access those kinds of therapies to not have, and I think also for our therapists to work with children in that way. And I know of some settings that were doing that online as well, which again was sometimes successful, but sometimes not. That has created some backlogs, as I understand, with the CCG, but we have increased investment by about a third around that, around speech and language as part of our work with the CCG on transforming the speech and language pathway. And schools will also have a linked speech and language therapist in the new model, which will help them target support early and get that additional time from speech and language. So, yeah, it is a particular challenge at the moment, both in Dorset and also in other parts as well. Just looking through our questions here.
Hello, Vic, it's Kath. I'm just wondering whether you wanted me to come in on the Dingley's Promise question
yes, please,
around early years. So Dingley's Promise, we're working with them. They're an organisation who support early years settings around special educational needs and disabilities, and we've got a real partnership arrangement there. And absolutely, we're looking at that improving and increasing how we support young people in early years settings. So Liz Curtis-Jones is the strategic lead for early help in Dorset. She's not able to be with us this morning, but I'll certainly ask her to give us a fuller answer that we can publish after today around Dingley's Promise.
Thank you, Kath. And we have another question on social communication and mental health. So I'll probably hand over to Miriam Lee to answer that one. Thank you, Miriam.
Yes, so there's just in terms of that social communication difficulties within mainstream school settings, and certainly recognising that actually the pandemic, we know that the pandemic has the group of young people where they have found it harder are those with social communication difficulties, and certainly in relation to their mental health. Dorset Steps is one of the approaches that we're using in terms of supporting our schools to understand what is the cause of the behaviour, what's the cause of a young person withdrawing, whatever that behaviour might be, whether it's internalising or whether it's externalising. The STEPS approach is very much around understanding what the root cause of the behaviour is, and then being able to intervene and provide the support to that young person. Alongside that, we also have been working. We had with the government with some funds around Dorset wellbeing, recovery and wellbeing for education, and that involved us working with the schools to identify what they needed in terms of support, working and providing some support to the schools on some training that was nationally led by the Anna Freud Centre, and also in terms of being able to support the schools to understand anxiety and the root cause, again looking at the root causes of anxiety and how those present themselves. And as you said in the question, many of these children are young people who attain well, they hit their targets academically. That doesn't mean that their mental health is good. And also what we are trying to, what we're doing is working with the Anna Freud Centre and our partners and schools to look at what interventions can we put in place that are more around well-being, differentiating between when it's a mental health difficulty and a persistent difficulty that is having an impact across the child's whole life, to when it's an issue around well-being. And we can do the different things. Mental health support teams are supporting us around this work and helping us work with our schools to be able to implement different approaches, and to bring our schools into that place of working with parents as well, to ensure that we're wrapping around both the schools and families to ensure that we understand what the approach is to support those young people.
Thank you, Miriam. That's great. And I think that also answers a question that we had about Dorset Steps. And perhaps we could talk a little bit more about the Steps programme. I don't know if you could just do a minute or two on the Steps programme, but it's something we funded as a council, so it's available to schools and academies. It's not something that's exclusively for maintained schools, and we did that quite deliberately as part of our CPD offer. So when we talk about things like outreach and how we want to promote inclusion in mainstream, what we're really talking about is equipping our teachers in the classroom to be able to differentiate and to have a toolkit. And Dorset Steps is one of the tools that we want to be our language in Dorset across all schools and academies. You know, and certainly in my role, I work with academies, academy chief executives. I work with the DFE, and then also our maintained schools, and we work with them very much agnostically, you know, in terms of the support that's needed for children. So, but Miriam, I'll hand over to you to talk a little bit more about the Steps programme. I know that you're really passionate about that.
Thank you, Vic. Yeah, absolutely. So we're really, we're really pleased that we are in this position. It's really exciting to be able to roll this out across all schools, and we're offering this training to all schools. And as the person has said, it has worked really well in some of our schools, and we can really see the evidence. You've mentioned one primary school there where we know they have taken it on as a whole school approach. So the principle behind Dorset Steps is that we train a senior member of staff. It is a whole school approach to identifying the root causes of children's behaviour, and in order to change practice, the school needs to take that on as a whole school approach. We are targeting certain schools. We're promoting it across all our localities. The person, our Dorset Steps trainer, is attending head teacher briefings in all the localities, all the SENCO briefings. And what we're also doing some work around impact measures. So we're really engaged that whole engagement process with our schools. When they're coming on the training, we're asking them what will be different as a result of this training, making sure that we know that the training is having an impact. We know that training, unless we do that, training doesn't always have an impact, and we know we've got evidence of schools where they've come on that training and have recognised the need to change things as a whole system. And that's what we'll be using those schools in order to be able to, as examples of really good practice, and be able to set up those networks of good practice. It is a journey. We know that it's a journey that schools have to go on. And the bigger the school, then sometimes that journey may take a little bit longer. We have a high number. We've already had quite a significant number of schools attending the training, and the next step is to support those schools to implement that in their schools. And we've also included in that training our specialist teachers and educational psychologists to make sure that we're able to really wrap around the schools to implement that change.
Hello, I'm happy to come in here and talk about our Let's Talk events, which some of you may be aware of. These are where we as a local authority will hold face-to-face events for you. We did our first round of having those back to being face-to-face last autumn, and the dates for this spring term are almost all together now, and we'll be circulating those in the next couple of weeks. And so those are a really good opportunity for you to come and meet with the teams from the localities and talk through some of the challenges that you're facing. And we usually try to theme them around specific areas. They're not designed for you to come and have a kind of a personal one-to-one with those professionals. It's where we like to look at the themes. We like to look at the broader issues and really capture your views and thoughts about. So, for example, it might be around the annual review process, or it might be around how you go about seeking additional provision. You know, it's that kind of way in which we use them as a way of really finding out from you as parents and carers what matters most to you. And again, increasingly, we're trying to widen the involvement from our partners at those events. So what we'd really like to see is colleagues from Hal's team, for example, from the Children with a Disability Service being alongside us, and colleagues from health as well, as we know that those are very key issues for you. So as I say, the dates for those will be published very soon. We've got another round, and in fact what I'm asking the teams to do is to set dates for the remainder of the year, so you've got plenty of notice of when those are coming up, and those will be held within the localities, and we'll publish those soon.
Thank you, Kath. And I'm mindful of the time, so it's 10:20, and we have a little bit of time left, so there's a couple of additional questions in here at the moment. So I'm just having a quick look through what we have. I think some are being answered in the chat as well. So in terms of post-16, there are a couple of questions about what do young people do at post-16 where perhaps they have either a learning need or anxiety and are struggling to engage in education or post-16 offer. We are working with our colleges to expand specialist provision for post-16, but also how they can deliver some outreach support as well to young people to support them in re-engaging in education. So there's some work that we do. We obviously offer that on a individual basis when we're working with a young person, and we can see that, and our inclusion services are always tracking children that might be falling out of education or struggling to re-engage. So in the locality team, as we described around SEND and our SEND provision leads, we also have inclusion leads who work with children who are either missing education or perhaps on a reduced timetable, maybe receiving some alternative provision, and making sure that we've got a plan in place around that. So hopefully that answers your question around that, but really there's not a general solution for all children. It's about working with you as a family and working individually about what that child, and also what that young person wants to do in their adulthood in terms of career opportunities and those kinds of things, and making sure that we've got good work happening, because there are different providers in the market that we would work with at various points. And then in terms of our special schools, as I said, Broadcroft have expanded in September. They'll be expanding their post-16 provision to offer a wider 16 to 19 offer. Coombe House will also have a post-16 offer, and many of our special schools already have great post-16 offers as well for more specialist provision. So we'll seek to expand that through our SEND capital strategy and that £40 million investment. Kath, are there any other questions we've not answered in the chat?
No, I think we've answered a lot of the questions in the chat. I've just posted an answer around a query about children and adult services working together, and we'd certainly anticipate the next time that we hold an event like this, which will hopefully be face to face, we will have adult services colleagues with us as well. The Birth to Settled Adulthood project is underway. It's a really big transformational piece of work, looking at a young person's journey through children's and on into adults, and trying to understand the best way in which the local authority can support those young people. What we're trying to avoid is the cliff edge. So when children move beyond 18, that gap and in terms of provision and what happens there. And I can certainly say that there is much better working between adults and children's. I absolutely appreciate that there will be instances where we haven't got it right. I'm very confident that we are aware of, and we know a lot of those individual circumstances, and there is really good focus work happening around that at the moment. So I can certainly give some reassurance that is work underway and is progressing.
Thank you, Kath. And I think I've got a query just as to whether Dorset Steps covers post-16. So I don't know, Miriam, if you're able to just confirm.
Yes, it does. It covers all. Dorset Steps is appropriate for all ages. It's also we're working with some of our social care teams as well. So in implementing Dorset Steps, rather than what the whole principle behind it is to reduce physical intervention, so the need to restrain or intervene physically, because as soon as you do that, then of course it causes more problems and escalates the situation. Dorset Steps supports us to think differently around that and put behaviour plans in place. I just wanted to also respond to, there's a question about ELSA, which are emotional literacy support assistants. And emotional literacy support assistants are teaching assistants who are trained and are supervised actually by educational psychologists. This is a very unique training programme, and they are trained in delivering interventions around emotional literacy support. They are a targeted intervention, so emotional literacy support is a targeted intervention, and schools, it's up to schools to identify those teaching assistants and to train them. We as a local authority are committed to rolling out and offering it on at least an annual basis. It's a 6-day training course, and then they have half-termly supervision as a group led by educational psychologists. We recognise that there is a demand on those particular teaching assistants with expertise, so we also encourage schools to use those professionals with that expertise to skill up some other staff to also be able to deliver some of that intervention at an earlier level. So at a universal and an earlier targeted level, those ELSAs can provide that additional support to other staff within the school. Holding the expertise doesn't mean they're the only people in the school that can deliver those interventions. They have the additional support and training, but they can also provide that support and understanding to their colleagues. I noticed there are a few questions here also around, so one of the questions here was around neurodiversity and psychoeducation and social therapy, and that we don't commission it. So that is a question for Elaine Hurl, and unfortunately she's had to leave us, really. It is something we recognise, isn't it? So for children, young people with ADHD, medication is part of the treatment, but it isn't the only. So alongside that, we would expect schools and other settings to be able to work, and other professionals to be able to support those universal settings to be able to do that psychoeducation alongside it. We are rolling out some training for all schools on ADHD, and in recognition that it's often a misunderstood, it's often seen as a behavioural issue rather than actually a neurodiversity. And we need to respond differently and support that child to understand themselves in order to be able to learn to manage themselves. We'll pick this question up, I think, with Elaine as well in terms of that commissioned and what we're doing in terms of moving forward. They are part of the All Age Autism Review and Neurodiversity as well, that group of young people with ADHD.
That's great. Thanks so much, Miriam. We're pretty much spot on, coming up for 10:30 now. I'm just going to try and pop some email addresses in the chat bar for you, for our colleagues from the clinical commissioning group who've unfortunately had to leave us this morning, so that they're in there. But thank you all very much for your time. I'll hand you back to Vic just to sum up, but we've really appreciated your honesty and openness with us this morning.
Thank you. I think, sorry, I'm just being told we've got another 15 minutes actually, so I'll just check if that is correct. So we may be potentially trying to draw to a close a bit early. So we'll continue on with a few more of the questions. I think we've probably, I'm scanning through, and apologies for looking away for a moment just while I scan through the questions as they come in thick and fast. In terms of local area, there appear to be kind of limited offer for out of school activities for children with SEND. I think that's one we'll take away. We are focusing in on short breaks. You'll know there were things like the Holiday Activity Fund in the summer of last year that we were delivering. So a number of schools supported us with our wider holiday activities, but also in terms of short breaks. So I think I'll drop my email into the chat. I'm very happy to kind of take that question offline as well.
Likewise, Vic. I think that's sort of my area too. But
yeah.
but I I recognise that actually so my service, when it's providing short breaks, it often does so with direct payments, and actually what I'd really like to see is a bit more of a kind of play scheme and after school activity offer in Dorset. So we are doing work around reviewing our short breaks offer and recommissioning short breaks provision. Big bit of work, but absolutely I agree. We're ambitious to create kind of accessible spaces where disabled children can go and socialise and play, and we don't necessarily have to provide sort of one-to-one isolated short breaks for them. So I'm sort of sorry but pleased to see that suggestion come up, really, and we are definitely wanting to work on it. So yeah, I'll leave my email as well, and I'd really welcome your input on that.
Thank you. I'll just check with colleagues, but I don't see any additional questions that we haven't answered to. Think in terms of what's been published through now.
I mean, there was one which I think we began to pick up really about crossover between autism and mental health need, and kind of joining up services there, and kind of a big unmet need there was a question. So I know that our our colleagues from NHS had to leave us, and we will pick up that discussion on this evening's session as well. But yes, it's an area of joint work and need that we're kind of, I think, increasingly conscious of and wanting to do better on. And certainly a lot of the most needy children in my service are ones who are kind of on the edge of mental health admission and have a diagnosis of autism. So they are kind of at the front of our minds, that group of children.
Thank you, Hal. And so there's a couple of new questions coming in now. So there's a question about behaviour online and how that might be playing into children's day-to-day language and behaviours. And it is something we're working with schools on in terms of supporting them around safe use of online tools and chat and other things, but also gaming. So there is an aspect of toolkit that we will be putting out this year to schools as well, but it is an area that we often work with schools on in terms of staying safe online. It's work that we often do with the police, but also how we can do that. So I would say the Dorset Education Advice Line is a good place if you're concerned about that. It's a good place to start that conversation. That allows us to have those conversations with specific schools if we think they need some additional support around that, but also that offering support in terms of how you might be able to manage that better at home, and some techniques and tools that you might be able to use to help manage that, which might be support from our educational psychologists, might be support from our specialist teachers who can just give you some over the phone advice on those kind of themes. Okay, I think there's a question about direct payments, which Hal, I'll leave you to reply privately to, and then
I'll just, because it'll be relevant to others, I'll try to answer it quickly, but then I'll leave my email address obviously in response to this specific question. But so the question is about the process really for getting direct payments, and we're unclear how to get it. So again, my service, Children Who Are Disabled, works with the most severely and profoundly disabled children in Dorset. So there might be a question about eligibility, but I'm always very happy to sort of talk through with families and parents and professionals whether a child might meet our eligibility criteria. And sometimes sometimes it's as much about impact as it is about diagnosis. So when we can see that a family is really struggling, we would want to come alongside and support. But yeah, how it works is that short breaks are direct payments, which was in the question. They can only be accessed through an assessment in my service. So either a family worker or a social worker would do an assessment of the family. They would come to my panel, and we would talk about need and meeting that need through provision, a direct payment. So I'll leave my email address here, but that's how it works. So, but anyone can refer in. So we've got the single point of access really in Dorset. So we'll we'll leave those contact numbers, but the same contact numbers you would get in touch with your SEND team, and then that will get passed through to children who are disabled for us to kind of pick up and run.
Thank you, Hal. I'll we have 10 minutes left, and I think we are up to date with answering the questions they've been coming through. I think we've had over 40 questions through the course of the event, some of which have been answered in the chat. So we've offered you an email address for you to contact us outside if it's a more specific query to yourself, so that we can have a more in-depth conversation, or try to answer that through this conversation here. I'm looking to colleagues. I don't think there are any that we have missed so far, but there is a little bit of time left, so I'm going to just pause for a moment to allow any final questions to come through, and then perhaps we'll round up as well. Okay, I'll keep an eye on that new questions, but if not, we'll start to round up. So really, thank you for joining this morning. It's really important that we keep conversations like this going, and you know, I think at some point we'd like to convert these back into in-person events. Our Let's Talk events are a really great example of where we'll bring those back on now that it's more safe to do that. But we know for a lot of families who are busy, this kind of interaction works better. And you know, being able to manage this around your day is helpful. We're running this again in the evening, but we're really grateful. So we've had 30 attendees today, so that's a really positive number of attendees for us, and lots of questions, so more than one question from each family, which is fantastic. My thanks to Dorset Parent Carer Forum, who've been helping us in setting these events up, and helped us last time we set these up as well. We hope you found this useful. If you've got a number of email addresses where you may want to reach out to us, but you know, you can always contact me if there are queries that you may want to raise separately. So really, from myself, thank you to Hal Williams, who leads our quad team, so Kath Saunders, who's our portfolio lead for SEND and head of service, and Miriam Lee, who's our principal EP. Our colleagues from CCG have had to go, but will be back on this evening for the evening event, and we will round up a kind of frequently asked questions and the kind of themes that have come from this event in our next newsletter. So if you're not already signed up to our newsletter, please do sign up. It comes out routinely, and there's always new information about events we're running, about particular things that are relevant to you, and also, you know, again, thank you to Dorset Parent Carer Council, because that's a co-produced piece of work that we do together. There haven't been any further questions. I think we will draw the session to a close, and thank you all for attending. So thanks everybody for joining us. As I said, we'll do this again. We'd like to make this a regular event, and hopefully at some point in person as well. But thank you again, and thank you to colleagues who've been supporting us in the background to manage the event. So thank you all, and have a lovely rest of the week.